like maybe what we saw with Sassou Nguesso or what we see in Angola and Uganda. But it's not unique in the sense of a certain type of politics reclaiming dominance over formerly democratic institutions. And I think that's a worrisome trend across the continent.
What about the fact that there is a precedence? When you go back to the colonial days, Congo happened, in fact, to have been a personal property of the king of Belgium.
Yes, and it's the great tragedy of Congo that it's never broken free of that historical legacy. It started out with the violence, the absolutely reprehensible violence done to the peoples of that area by the adventures of King Leopold. And unfortunately, it's only gotten worse over the years. You had Mobutu, which Dr. Englebert just referred to, and then we have now this regression. If we look at very closely at the governance record of Kabila, what we have is a regression to what has very sadly been the tragic norm of the Congo. And that really is the real tragedy, that this country, which was once described as a geological scandal, all the riches in the world, even at today's deflated prices, we're talking $20+ trillion worth of mineral resources, and yet the great poverty, the lack of services, and even the lack of basic respect for the rule of law and the rights of the citizen.
We could probably, in fact, inform our audience that the uranium that was used to build a nuclear bomb, the bomb that was, of course, thrown on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, actually came from the Congo.
Yes, and all of our electronic devices that many of us rely on, day to day, these would not be possible without the rare earth minerals coming out of the Congo.
Coltan.
Yes.
That is a country, arguably, perhaps one of the richest, frankly, on this planet Earth, because you name it, it is there, and yet the people are very poor.
Yes.
So what's missing here?
Well, I think what's missing has been governance. We've had people ruling but not governing, providing the basic goods and services that citizens have an absolute right to expect, and which is the norm to expect. But we don't have it. We have a record of plunder. We have a report coming out that will be released tomorrow at the Atlantic Council that Pierre has authored, looking very closely at this issue and taking stock of what has happened during Kabila's period in power in the Congo.
Very interesting. Now we will pause for a short break and would like to remind you that Straight Talk Africa is now on the social networking website Twitter, and we are tweeting live. Follow us at VOA Shaka, that's VOA Shaka, and join in on today's discussion with your questions and comments. Don't forget to use the hashtag, and we are a gentleman by the name of Howard French, who you might in fact be familiar with because he used to be a key journalist for the New York Times, covering Africa from Abidjan. And he covered the Congo very, very closely. And he talks about one time when Bill Clinton, who was then president, personally wrote a letter to Mobutu Sese Seko, in a sense, to really step down. This was before Mobutu was, of course, attacked by the neighboring countries back in 97?
Yes.
Yeah. What about that? That, in fact, Clinton's ambassador to the United Nations at the time personally took that letter and handed it to Mobutu Sese Seko, who read it and said, wait a minute, I have been with you all this time. I have been delivering. What is wrong with you? I'm going nowhere.
Yes, and today the current Bill Clinton's successor in the Oval Office, President Barack Obama, last year personally called Joseph Kabila to urge him to follow the good example of Goodluck Jonathan, who, despite wanting to stay on, accepted the democratic verdict and had the historic transition in Nigeria to do the same. It's a message that has been repeated by the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and other officials down the line. The U.S. position has been very clear. The Congolese constitution needs to be respected, and it's Joseph Kabila can best assure his place in history by respecting it. Unfortunately, I think it's been an exercise in futility, because all indications are that that appeal, however reasonable, has fallen on deaf ears.
When these people meet, really, what do they talk about? For example, the Secretary of State, John Kelly, reportedly met with President Kabila in New York recently. What do they actually talk about?
I think part of it is urging someone like him to... There is a future. I think one of the problems was the original sin, if you will, in this was back in 2001, when his father, Laurent Désiré Kabila, was assassinated by his own bodyguard. And then Joseph was 29, did not even speak Lingala, the lingua franca of the western part of the country, was stepped into the office without even the color of law, and the international community acquiesced to it. And since then, he's been there, and he's a young man. He's still in his early 40s. He has a long life ahead of him. We've established a principle of impunity, and now what's he going to do? There have been reports, and the Panama Papers have augmented, that his family have enriched themselves. Are they going to be able to keep their wealth? Is he going to have to look over his shoulder for the rest of his days, fearing prosecution either for human rights abuses, war crimes from the Civil War, or the ill-gotten gains of the last few years? So that's not a very attractive future for him. So one has to try to persuade someone like him that there is a future that doesn't necessarily entail a one-way plane ticket to The Hague.
What about the Panama Papers? Is there anything more that you can tell us about that, in fact, as it concerns Joseph Kabila? Because I saw the twin sister's name, Jeanette Kabila, being displayed very prominently. Do you have any details on that?
Well, only the details. I can relay the details that the international consortium of journalists who have this trove of documents, have been publishing their analyses, have put out there. And it appears that not only is Sister Jeanette displayed there, but she seems to have had hidden interests in some of the more lucrative concessions and licenses, including in the telecom sector in the country. One of the president's closest business associates, Israeli billionaire Dan Gertler, is mentioned some 200 times in the documents that have been publicized so far, including, interestingly, in a report just released by Global Witness, the NGO, looking at these documents, that apparently some of the concessions for petroleum in the Democratic Republic of the Congo were given to firms that were created through the mechanisms of the shell companies run through Panama, and that somewhere in the, and again, this is the analysis that's been published by those who have access to the papers, something like $1.3 billion worth of revenue that belongs to the Congolese state have evaporated into these shell companies. So there's quite a lot, and I'm sure there's more to come.
Very interesting, because long ago, during the Carter administration, there was a story about Mobutu Sese Seko coming to Washington and asking for aid when he was asked to perhaps to borrow his government, the government of Congo, because he was reputed to be one of the 5 richest men in the world. He responded by saying that, I don't trust the Congolese government because it may not be able to pay back. Very interesting. You are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of a discussion in a moment. But first, here is social media reporter Ayen Bior. Take it away, Ayen.
Thanks, Shaka. And still to come, we'll reveal some of the outstanding feedback we've received from our audience through social media. But now here's our letter of the week from a Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gizui Yuwat. And of course, this is Straight Talk Africa, coming to you live from Washington. Coming back to you, of course, Peter, there are some cynics, in fact, who say that, when it comes to corruption, it comes to bad governance and what have you, that seems to be a monopoly, really, of Africa. Is it an African pedigree, really? You look at some examples, for example, in most recent changes in Europe. Look at the country that, was, of course, the master of Angola or of Portugal. of Cape Verde and what have you, you know, when you look at that country, honestly, and you think about the 1974 Carnation Revolution, the captain's coup, honestly, Portugal. Can you believe that they just did that and the event turned into a democratic process? They have actually never looked back. Portugal is democratic. What happened to Africa, for example? I mean, look, Angola, Mozambique, you name it, except, of course, Cape Verde, little Cape Verde, perhaps.
Yes. Well, Shaka, I would reject the idea that corruption is somehow a congenital condition that Africa is condemned to living with. What I will say is there's a responsibility to go all around. There's a responsibility of the international community, which has all too long enabled or facilitated or at least condoned some of these corrupt leaders. But there's a tide changing there. But there's also the responsibility of Africans themselves, both inside countries, and I think with more information, etc., I think people are seeing something different and wanting aspiring to something different. And increasingly, although it's taking baby steps, one has to acknowledge progress, the African Union as a whole and African leaders are less. It was very telling in 2011 when Joseph Kabila essentially stole that election. It was very telling that he could only get one other African leader to attend his inauguration.
Do you have empirical evidence on that in fact he stole it?
Well, the evidence I take is the testimony of the country's Roman Catholic archbishops, who deployed more than 40,000 trained observers across the country and then pronounced the results illegitimate and not reflecting the will of the people. These are people who are not outside. They live with the people and they spoke their voice. Unfortunately, and I think it's very telling evidence that only Robert Mugabe was the only African leader who was willing to attend in person Kabila's inauguration in 2011. That's telling. Even some of our more controversial presidents who you've just named off have gotten a handful or more of their fellows to show up in solidarity. It's very telling when you only get one, and the one is Mugabe of Zimbabwe.
Very interesting.
Those are hard places.